Greetings. Welcome back to Old Ways Rising Farm YouTube channel on a beautiful, glorious, unseasonably warm March day. One of those days you just got to get outside and do some stuff in the garden. And this is grafting season. That's what we're going to be talking about today, grafting fruit trees. Now, grafting is a very, very old technique where you're going to take two trees, parts from two trees. The first is the rootstock, which, as the name implies, is the component where the roots are. And we're going to cut that down to a little stub, and then we're going to graft on top a scion, which is a branch from some other tree. Okay? Now, when this works, what's going to happen is that those two will grow together to become one tree, and in so doing, we have cloned the scion. Okay? Where we graft is when we want to take a tree, a good, old, beautiful, established, wonderful apple variety, and reproduce it exactly, so that the fruit of the offspring trees are identical to the fruit of the parent tree. Okay? Some people say you have to graft. No, there's a lot of ways to propagate an apple tree. You can propagate them from cuttings, and our rootstocks here are cutting-grown rootstocks. Okay? You can propagate them by air layering. We've talked about that already in the air layering video. Link at the top of the screen if you're curious. You can propagate apples by seed. Some will say you can't, but you absolutely can. They won't come true from seed, but they will be very close to the parents. Okay? So, if you take seed from, let's say you have a population of sugary table apples, right? Let's say you have red delicious, yellow delicious, and yellow transparent, right? And you have that cluster of three trees. And you collect seed and you grow them. Well, the offsprings won't be exact clones of either of the three parents, but they will be, you know, of the same use in culinary activities, right? They will be a sweet table apple. Likewise, if you take seed from a population of bitter spitter cider apples, the offspring will also be bitter spitter cider apples. And there's reason to do that. John Chapman, Johnny Appleseed, he went around spreading cider trees, and he did it by seed. He would take the press cake from one batch of cider, float the seeds out of it. We've shown how to do that. The Osage Orange video is a good example. Link at the top of the screen if you're curious. And separate seeds that way, grow them, and then disperse those offspring. He was an early orchardist, okay? A nurseryman. We'll come back to him in a minute. But when you want to have an old traditional variety and you want to make sure it is absolutely, truly, purely that old traditional variety, grafting is the fastest way to do it, okay? It comes pure, and it's very, very quick. It's very, very quick because, one, you're putting it on roots that already exist, so you don't have to grow out a root system from scratch, okay? And two, you're using mature wood, so you don't have the maturation process of a seed growing into a physiologically mature tree. It's already physiologically mature wood, okay? So it will begin to produce fruit as soon as that branch is physiologically capable of doing that, as soon as it's large enough and has enough fruiting spurs, okay? How long that takes will depend on variety and on rootstock. There are some rootstocks which push a lot of, stimulate the offspring tree to push a lot of top growth, and they come into fruit a little bit slower. And there are some that stimulate fruiting spur production. They come in a little bit faster, but just for sort of a generic description, a generic bland rule of thumb, if you don't know those details on how your scion is going to interact with the rootstock, 3 to 5 years is a good rule of thumb. Good rule of thumb, right? That's how long it takes ish on average ish for your grafted trees to come into fruit production. Okay? Now, we're going to talk about both the scion selection and the rootstock. First, I want to talk about the rootstock. These are commercial cutting grown rootstock. Okay? You can tell they're cutting grown. They have the stub here where it was dipped and stuck, okay? Dipped in rooting hormone and stuck. It's not going to show up super well on the camera, but I can feel it with my finger that there's a blunt cut there. And we have this poof of roots which grew out the side, okay? We're going to cut this about here and use it for grafting. There is also seed-grown rootstock. These are seed-grown. Are these in view, beloved?
Yes,
okay.
They're too much in view, actually.
Too much in view? Sorry. There we go. These are seed-grown Antonovka. Okay? And this is a variety of pie apple from Siberia that comes pretty much true from seed and is commonly used for rootstock. These will give a full-size tree. That's called a standard. Now, over the course of time, apples have crossbred with so many different crab apples and small species that there's a wide range of growth characteristics. And if you take an apple, which is coming from a very small tree, and you graft a larger tree on top of it, like take one of the shrubby crab apples and graft an edible apple on top of it, the shrubby crab apple roots will restrict the growth of the mature apple. And that's how we get dwarfing rootstocks. Okay? This has a very profound impact on how fast the tree will mature. A lot of dwarfing rootstocks will produce trees which put more energy into fruiting spurs faster than full-size rootstocks. Okay? So when you graft onto Antonovka in particular, it takes a lot longer to get your fruiting spurs. But no, this is a sliding scale. Okay? Some of your super dwarf trees that will only make a 5 or 10 foot tree, even if never pruned, and fruit very, very fast, or one end of the sliding scale in Antonovka with a full-size tree and relatively slow coming into fruit production is at the other end of the sliding scale, but there's a whole lot of diversity in the middle. So when you're picking rootstocks, that's one of the things you want to look at, is how long does it take this to produce fruit? You'll also want to look at what is the size of the mature tree. Standard means full-size 40, 50 foot tree. Super dwarf means 5 or 6 foot tree. Okay? Semi-dwarf usually means about a 20 foot tree. But then there's also full dwarf, which is halfway in between the super and the semi-dwarf. And you have semi-standard, which is halfway in between the semi-dwarf and the full-size tree. So you can tune the size of your tree to whatever you want it to be based on your choice of rootstock. I like big trees, so I have full-sized, standard, and these rootstocks are a semi-standard. So these will make like a 40, 50 foot tree. These will make like a 30 foot tree. Okay? I like big trees. Now, there's another thing you need to think about here, and that is as you go to more and more and more extreme dwarfing, you can have mismatches. So if you have a really aggressively growing apple, like Lodi is a very aggressive, fast-growing apple. If you put that on a super dwarf rootstock, they can kind of get into a fight with each other over time, and your tree won't be as long-lived. So commercial orchards like the full dwarf and super dwarf rootstocks because it keeps their trees small and minimizes, you can pack a lot in a small area, and it minimizes pruning chores. Okay? People that want large collections, like germplasm collections and orchards with a lot of diversity for cider, like the super dwarf and the full dwarf rootstocks, because again, you can crunch a lot of apples in variety into a small space. The trade-off, though, is that longevity. So if you go to full dwarf and super dwarf trees, you're going to tend towards shorter-lived trees as the more aggressive fruiting apples, scions, kind of get into fights with the super dwarf rootstocks. And you'll see it'll grow straight for a while, and then it'll kind of get like an elephant's foot grow over. And then you'll start to get, damage and rot spots and wounding below that elephant foot, and then the tree falls over. That's kind of what happens with the full and super dwarf rootstocks.
Mm-hmm.
The other trade-off is as you go to more and more dwarfing characteristics in your rootstock, you lose a little bit of cold hardiness. So where I am in upstate Pennsylvania, New York, New England, like that region of the country, right, that's where I am. In Eastern North America, really this is kind of once you're north of Route 80, you need to care about this. South of Route 80, you don't need to care about what I'm saying, okay, at all. But north of Route 80, you need to pay attention to the hardiness of your scion. Because you're going to lose a half a zone or a zone of hardiness and vigor as you go to the full and super dwarf rootstocks. So if you're north of Route 80 in a zone 4, and you're going to use a super dwarf rootstock, you want to use a zone 3 scion. Zone 3 hardy scion. If you're in zone 5, you want to use at least a zone 4 hardy scion. Okay? Again, rule of thumb, there's a lot of diversity, but do know that you lose some longevity and you lose some cold hardiness with the full and super dwarfs. Semi-dwarfs and up, you really don't need to care. The hardiness is true. Okay? And once you're below Route 80 and zone 6 and warmer, you don't need to care about this at all. But in the colder zones and in montane climates and in frost pocket areas, you do need to care about that. So, how do we think about our graft? Well, when we look at a tree, and let me just grab a chunk of firewood here. The core of the tree down here, it's split out in this piece of firewood, but the core of the tree, the heartwood, is dead. It's inert. The tree is going to use its ray parenchyma to pump waste products into there as a dumping ground, and that's why heartwood is differently colored than sapwood. But it's inert. It's not doing anything. The sapwood is transmitting nutrients and water up the trunk. Okay? And the sapwood is also not alive. It's active, but it's not alive. The cells are produced, they die, they hollow out, and then they make good soda straws after they're hollowed out. Right outside the sapwood is the vascular cambium. Okay? The vascular cambium produces, it's alive, growing, dividing cells, producing the sapwood and the phloem, which is the inner bark. Okay? And then the phloem on the outside of that is the cork cambium, which produces the true bark, the outer bark. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that that boundary between the sapwood and the phloem, where those living cells live, that little teeny tiny layer of living cells, and this is the green tissue inside the bark, that's what is going to seal the two parts of our graft together. Okay? Those have to line up. If your two twigs are exactly the same diameter and same growth direction, and you can line up those on both edges, great. You have two chances for it to seal together. If not, then you need to favor one to be perfectly flush and throw the air to the other side. It can still take. But if you have a mismatch and you try to center it, it will never take. Because what's going to happen is the tree is going to recognize that it's been wounded in the grafting. I'll show you the grafting cut that I use here in a minute. And it's going to recognize that it's been wounded, and it's going to start to grow callus tissue out from that vascular cambium. When the callus tissue touches, it fuses and then produces a new growth ring from that point. So in the second year after the graft, that new growth ring is where it becomes to be one tree. But if you have a stagger, right, let's say here, we have the vascular cambium on the outside here, and then on the graft, it's moved to the inside. It will never grow enough to fuse before the scion dies. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, there's a lot of different ways to graft. I'm going to show you one. I'm not showing you this one because it's the only one. I'm not showing you this one because it's even the best or the fastest. I'm showing you this one because in my opinion, it's the easiest to learn on. Okay? And this is called a cleft graft. We need a scion. And I have a couple of old varieties that I'm working with. I have some friends with a collection of old apple trees. So I got Ribston Pippin, which is the ancestor of Cox Orange Pippin, Newtown Pippin, and Ashmead's Kernel. 3 real classic old varieties. And I have some cuttings from a neighbor who has a family story of a cluster of trees that have been propagated by their family that go back to John Chapman, Johnny Appleseed. So I'm calling these Chapman Spitter. They don't really have a name other than that. But I know the family, and they have the oral history of where these trees go back. So that's pretty cool. We're going to take one. So I don't have as much of that. We'll do Ashmead's Kernel here. When you're selecting your scions, you want to select young, actively growing wood. So your water sprouts, these whips that everybody likes to cut out when you're pruning, make the best grafting stock. Okay? So cut your whip, and then if you're not going to use it immediately, this was just cut yesterday, cut it into pieces that'll fit into a bag and seal it up so they don't dry out. Okay? The race is, in order for the graft to take, the callus has to grow and fuse together faster than the scion cutting dries out. That's the difference between success and failure. Okay? So we'll work with Ashmead's Kernel here. The first cut is going to be on the rootstock. So we're going to come, we are going to snip it short, and I'm going to stick that in water because we can dip and stick that and go grow some more cutting grown rootstock. Now next you need a super sharp knife. I like to use my little hawksbill chip carving knife for this. You can also use one of these snap-off utility craft knives. Don't use a pocket knife. Not a standard pocket knife. There are pocket grafting knives, but don't use a standard pocket knife. Now, a cleft graft is a wedge inside of a slit. When I'm doing it this way, I like to make the wedge on the rootstock. And this is just Boy Scout whittle, a very flat wedge taper. Your knife has to be very, very sharp because you can't disturb the bark. If the bark peels away from the stick, that section of the graft won't take. So we're not talking about woodworking sharp. This needs to be surgical scalpel or razor hone sharp, like straight razor sharp. I always polish this knife up on a 6,000 grit Waterstone. Okay? So there's my flat taper, wedged in from both directions, front, side, back, side, and all of the bark is still sticking even though I brought it up to a knife edge point here. Now, there's some wind, so I'm just ducking that in the water so it doesn't dry out there. We'll get our, which one did I say we were going to do? Ashmead's Kernel. So I'm going to get my scion. Get my tape out. Get my scion. And now I'm going to cut about 4 or 5 buds worth of scion here. Put that back in the bag. I just put a little dribble of water in the bag to keep them from drying out. It's better to wrap them in wet paper towel if you're going to store these for several weeks, but I'm only storing them for a day, so I just put a little dribble in there. Now this, I'm going to come to the pith in the middle. The pith is a little cylinder of storage tissue, soft parenchyma tissue. And I'm going to set my knife right on that pith and rock it back and forth, careful to keep it centered, until I've made about 1.5 or so centimeters of slit there. Now do this in one smooth motion. Don't take it out and put it back in and take it out and put it back in. You'll get splinters and chatter in there, and then it won't come together right. Now we're going to take our rootstock piece and slide it over there, making sure we have good contact between those green layers. Now on this one, my scion is a little bigger than my rootstock, so I can feel this. Your finger is very, very sensitive. Make sure it's absolutely dead flush on your working side. Now I look over here, it's not flush. So this side has a good chance of taking. This side does not. That won't take it all, but that's okay. I only need it to take in one spot, and it will overgrow all of this. Now I'm doing my cleft in the scion and my wedge in the rootstock. This is backwards from how most people show a cleft graft. But I like to do it this way because think about this growing out in the field. I want the water to drain off. If you do it the other way, water can hold up here and cause rot problems. So I'm doing this upside down from typical so that the water drains well. Now the next thing is we need to wrap this with some florist tape to hold it together. And this stage is where I can really explain why I like this graft so much. And it's because the cleft graft has natural clamping tension on it. So I don't need to be too concerned about it staying in place right where it is. It's going to hold itself in that position. Most other grafting methods, you have to be super careful and diligent to make sure that doesn't slide around. Okay? So, let me just get a stick here, just a random stick. When you're doing a simple whiff graft with an angle cut, like that, and then you put these together, and then you tie around them. Well, now you have a lot of wiggle that can happen. There's no clamping tension holding that in place. It's trying to go away, and it's fighting you. And it's more difficult, in my opinion, it's more difficult to keep your alignment. And that will result in a lower take percentage. Okay? So we have this taped off. I'm going to put it back in the bag for the time being. And I want to go to these. This pot. Okay. I want to get this so it's kind of angled towards you a little bit. There we go. Can you see this, well beloved? Okay. This pot are some grafts that didn't take from previous years. You're not out anything if your graft doesn't take. You can just stick these in a pot and come back to them in a future year. Okay? And you can see right here, that's one of my grafts. And this sealed, this actually did seal, but it didn't grow well, and the rootstock overgrew the graft, and the tree aborted the graft section. Mm-hmm. So the graft took, but I don't know exactly what happened here either. It could have been me not paying enough attention, or it could have been just it took partially but then dried out, or something damaged the growing buds. I don't know. But the tree overgrew it. So this is Antonovka that has grown in this pot quite happily, and I have another chance to graft it. But I want to take this stalk and show you the more typical arrangement This is borderline for this pair of pruners. The more typical arrangement of a cleft graft. So we can take this and now we can split this down the pith like that. And now I'm going to do this pot with these ones that I'm calling Chapman spitters here. Humor intended. And this time I'm going to prepare the wedge in the scion piece. You can get some very nice folding grafting knives, but I keep my woodworking tools grafting knife sharp, so I just do it this way. Okay, so now there's the wedge in the scion. Also, always make sure your buds are pointing up. And now, because of this fact that I only need the cambium to line up in one location, I'm just going to wedge that open a little with the knife. I can actually put two attempts to graft in one wedge cut. Whittling quickly. This is never as smooth when you're trying to demonstrate it as when you're just doing it yourself. So those are arranged. Okay. So we have two Chapman spitters in one piece. Now I'm going to wrap the whole thing in the florist tape, and then we'll talk about grafting wax. Now notice I'm doing this right in the pot. One of the ways you can go about grafting is to take your rootstocks, plant them directly in the ground. Let them grow for a year or two and then do this right in place. When you're wrapping these, always make sure that that split is completely covered. Make sure that the top is completely covered. And make sure that the cut surface of your individual scion pieces is completely covered in tape. Some people use cellophane for this, and that works perfectly well. There's more than one way to skin this cat. I like this florist tape because it degrades in about 6 months.
So it's not going to girdle the tree.
So it won't girdle the tree. I don't have to worry about going out. Shifted that one a little bit. And that right there is the single biggest reason the grafts fail, is shifting them a little bit while you're doing this extra process. Okay? I don't have to worry about coming out and taking it off later. It's kind of like a self-dissolving suture. Okay? Because by the time that the tree starts to grow and expand in girth, and here, since I know I shifted, I'm using my finger and thumb just to feel and come out and touch that tape. Okay? It's a lot like a self-dissolving suture. This will just fall off when it's time. Now, grafting wax. You can go and spend a lot of money on grafting wax, but some of you might recognize what I'm holding is a toilet bowl gasket. These are about $2.50 American. Okay? Get the ones that don't have any fancy filler or, some of these have like a fiber embedded in them to make it stronger. Don't get those. They're more money and they're a pain in the butt for grafting. Don't get them. Don't get the ones that like have extra plastic material in to fill space. No, just get the simple, boring, cheap wax gasket. This makes a wonderful, inexpensive grafting wax. And what we want to do is smear this all over the area where we have put our tape. We're doing this to slow the loss of moisture so that we have more time for the graft union to come together. Because this is a race in which we want that callus tissue to form and fuse faster than the scion dries out. Okay? So there's our grafting wax, and now also in the interest of keeping these nice and moist, we can put a little bit on the top of each of them. Set that aside. We'll pull out this one, same deal. Smear it. And then coat the top. Now, timing on this. The best grafting season is right at the end of your pruning season. Your pruning season starts when your trees go completely dormant and ends at the sap run. Your grafting season for these sorts of fruit trees starts at the sap run and continues until the buds start to swell. Okay? And you can easily take scions, wrap them in some paper towel, put them in Ziplocs, put them in your fridge. They'll keep for a month. Okay? So these water shoots that you're collecting as you're pruning are great to save for grafting to expand your orchard. Okay? So when you're buying new trees for your orchard or buying scions, don't just think about the purchase price of the tree. Think about the purchase price of the tree divided by the infinite number of grafts that you can get off of one tree. Okay? So if you want to go for instant orchard, sure, spend the money on all those trees. If you're patient and money limited, you can buy one tree of an awesome variety at whatever it costs. Don't worry about it. Because you can then go and buy these $3 rootstocks and make 100 of them. Okay? So as you get better at plant propagation, the cost of nursery stock looks a lot friendlier. Okay? The last thing we need to do is to plant these. So I'm going to take this scion, or sorry, not this scion, but this is the top I cut off of the rootstock. Just going to cut that in half. Dip both ends in water. Dip it in some rooting hormone. Stick it. Dip it in some rooting hormone. Stick it. So as I go, I'm setting myself up for more next year. Okay? You can also purchase seed for these guys. And, you know, a pound of seed is not that much money and will grow. Holy cow, it'll grow a lot. So I'm not going to worry about sticking cuttings from these. I will stick cuttings from these guys. Apples are not the easiest plant to grow from cuttings. You're not going to expect a huge success rate from these. But I know from observation that these are grown from cutting, so there's a very good chance that I'll have enough yield from this to be worth trying. Okay? Now we want to label things. I like to make my labels just out of, this is just a piece of a soda can, and you write on it with a ballpoint pen and it makes an impression in the aluminum. And these are durable labels that won't rot out. So let me find the right one. I need Ashmead's kernel, that one, and I need Chapman's spitter. So Chapman's spitter I'm going to put right in that pot. And now our Ashmead's kernel. Where'd my pots go? There'd my pots go. I'm going to put in a pot with some soil. And this is about 50-50 mix of potting soil and shredded pine bark. And I'll do 3 or 4 of these and actually put them all in there. So I'm not going to go all the way to plant that, but I want to stick my label in there. Okay, so now we know these are Ashmead's kernel. This is what I'm calling Chapman's spitter. And if you have space, if you're only doing a few of these and you have space inside, you could bring these right in, let them warm up and let them start growing. Or you could leave them outside and let them come to life with the seasons. Okay? As a last thought on selecting rootstock here, you need to make sure it's compatible with what you want to graft onto it. So all apple trees are compatible with all apple rootstocks. They're pretty friendly that way. Pears, same deal, right? All pears will grow on all pear rootstocks. There's also a few other closely related species that are somewhat compatible, right? Pears can be grafted onto hawthorn. And I think there's a compatibility there with mountain ash as well. Okay? I'm not 100% sure on that one. I think they're pretty closely related. Your stone fruits are a little bit narrower, right? You want sweet cherry on sweet cherry rootstock. You want peach on peach rootstock. It's a little narrower than just, okay, everything in the genus gets along. Okay? Nut trees are usually pretty compatible within the genus, but they want to be grafted more toward the bud swell and not so much early in the cold weather. They have a higher take rate with your nut trees later, closer to the bud swell. The exception is chestnut, which will not graft, period, end of story, as far as I know. If you've heard of a successful chestnut grafting story, I'd love to hear it. Correct me if I'm wrong, absolutely, but I've never heard of chestnut being successful in grafting. It's stubborn like that. The fruit trees are a lot more flexible. So do your research when you're picking your rootstocks for the characteristics you want, the characteristics that you want to bring out in your offspring, and your compatibility, and your time frame. Okay? So you really want to study each individual species of tree on its own terms. But this isn't hard. This isn't super difficult. You're not going to have 100% take rate, right? Like this was a pot where about three took and 3 didn't. Right? This pot was, half of it's in the ground, starting to grow into big trees, and half of it's here getting regrafted. But you're not out anything. If you pot these like this, you're not out anything. You can just graft them next year. So I hope that you will try this. I hope that you will go and invest and get some really wonderful varieties, knowing that you can graft a large number at your farm, as we're doing here at Old Ways Rising Farm. So if you're enjoying this content and would like to help us out, and go visit our Patreon, there's a link in the description. But either way, I'm grateful you're here, and we'll see you next time at Old Ways Rising Farm.